American Chess Cup 2025 semifinals, Fabiano Caruana versus LEVON Aronian. Two classical games ended in a draw, and we have blitz games to determine the winner. First blitz game, Caruana plays white, starts with the move e4. We have e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6. Two knights opening, slow classical variation with the move d3. Bishop goes to e7, knight c3, all developing moves, d6, preparing to develop the bishop on g4, a3, castle, bishop goes back to a2, and bishop e6 to counter that light square bishop on a2. Knight goes to d5. Now black have to be careful. They cannot take the knight with the knight, because after e takes d5 there would be a fork and they will lose a piece. Black plays a5, starting some activity on the queen side of the board. Bishop e3, bishop moves back to d7, exchange of the knights on f6, and provocative move from Caruana h4, allowing black to get to a square g4. And now there is no move h3 to knock this bishop out. Queen d2. Caruana is not afraid for Aronian to take the knight on f3, because after bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3, white would have an open g file and black king will not be safe. Queen e7. Not a bad move, but also it traps the black squared bishop. So now it doesn't really have any moves. And immediately knight g5. And now black can play h6 to knock this knight out. But it doesn't mean anything, because if black plays h6, white do not have to remove the knight. Because after black takes the knight on g5, pawn takes on g5, remember that black bishop on f6 is trapped, it has no moves. Therefore, Aronian continues his attack on the queen side of the board with a4. f3, attacking the bishop, bishop moves back, a long castle for Caruana. He is all in this first blitz game. He is prepared to attack on the king side of the board. Aronian puts his knight in the center of the board, knight d4. Caruana doesn't want to take this, keep that knight there. He exchanges his bishop for that knight. E takes d4 and f4, creating space on the king side of the board, but again allowing black to get the bishop to a square g4, attacking the rook. Rook e1, h5 to support that bishop. Prophylactical standard move in these positions, king b1, rook a6 for Aronian. He wants to move the rook to a b file and somehow attack the white king. Rook f1 and king h8. That's the first big mistake of the blitz game for Aronian, because now after e5, d takes e5, white has a tactical shot, knight takes f7. And now after rook takes f7, they can take the pawn on e5, and the bishop on f6 is under attack and it's pinned, because the rook on f7 would be captured. So that's what Caruana was supposed to play, but instead he took the rook on f7. That was a mistake, and black actually were getting a better position if they played e4 here. e4, the bishop on f7 is still under attack, and if the bishop goes away, after e3 attacking the queen, black is without an exchange, but the pawn on e3 is an absolutely monstrous passing pawn. Two bishops are also very active, and black has a decisive advantage in this position. Aronian didn't find the move e4. He took the pawn on h4, counter-attacking. It looks good because the bishop on f7 is under attack and the rook on e1 is under attack. But white has a simple response to this, bishop c4, attacking the rook on a6. And after exchanges on e1 and black plays rook b6, attacking the pawn on a3, using the fact that pawn on b2 is pinned by the rook. The king moves away to a1. King h7. The pawn on e5 could not be protected anyway, so Aronian didn't even try. Rook takes e5, queen h4, and rook e8. Caruana wanted to threaten the check on g8, but it turns out that that check doesn't do anything for white's position, and this position is already pretty even. Rook goes to f6, possibly putting pressure on the pawn on f4. Bishop g8 check, but after king g6, despite the fact that the king is pretty much in the middle of the board, there is no real opportunity to attack this king for Caruana, and Caruana plays bishop d5, hitting the pawn on b7. And after queen g3, it turns out that black completely equalized the game, because the pawn on f4 is under attack, and black were able to activate all their pieces. Bishop e4 check, bishop f5, and in this position, this move was not the best move, and white had to continue with the move rook h8. He didn't find this continuation, Caruana, and he played rook e5. And after exchange of the bishops on e4, black played c5 to protect the pawn on d4, when we have an endgame which is absolutely even. But again, this is a blitz game. Caruana has 10 seconds on the clock, LEVON Aronian has 5 seconds on the clock. Mistakes could happen, and they did happen. King a2, b6, queen e2, offering exchange of the queens on g4. Caruana declines, queen f2, queen f5, check. The king moves away, queen h4, rook g6 attacking the pawn on g2, rook e5, and it seems like the pawn on h5 is gonna be lost because the queen has to move away, and then the white will take the pawn on h5. But black found a nice way to protect the pawn, starting with the move queen f7 check. The king must move away, and rook h6, and the pawn on h5 is all of a sudden protected. g3, queen g6, rook g5 killing the queen moves away, queen h1, and here is a mistake. King g8. King g8, and now queen d5 check, king h8, and white were winning with the move rook e5, and Caruana found this winning move, queen g8 and queen e4. And now the threat of rook e8 and to win the queen, and unfortunately for Aronian, there is no way to defend against it. He played rook f6, thinking that on rook e8 he will play rook f8. The problem for him is that first white takes the pawn on h5, rook takes h5, black must play rook h6 not to lose the queen, and now they go back to e5, and after rook f6 and rook e8 he resigned, because after rook f8 there is a beautiful check from h1, queen h1 check, and it turns out that the only move is queen h7 to block the check, and after rook f8 that's a checkmate. Game 2, Aronian was playing white, Caruana was playing black. I just want to start with this position. Aronian has two extra pawns. He has an advantage of 2 bishops. His position is winning, but again, with just 8 seconds on the clock, anything could still happen in this game. But after he played d6, Caruana blundered inexplicably the rook, putting it on a square h8. Aronian quickly took it with the bishop, and Caruana resigned, and the match was tied at 1-1, and game number 3. Aronian playing white, Caruana playing black. Aronian starts with d4 this time, not e4. d5, knight f3, knight f6, e3, a6, c4, standard developing moves, c5, creating some pressure in the middle of the board, b3 to develop the bishop on b2, Exchange of the pawns on d4, e takes d4, b6, bishop develops to b2, bishop b7, bishop d3, and knight c6. Again, both players are just developing pieces, nothing much is happening. Castle, bishop d6, queen e2, and short castle for Caruana. Rook d1, knight e7 to free up the bishop on this diagonal. Knight goes to the middle of the board on e5, knight g6 to put some pressure on the knight, but still it's very well protected here. f4. f4. Now black needs to make sure not to take on e5, because after f takes e5, they will lose a piece due to this fork. Queen e7, queen e3, a5, some activity for Caruana on the queen side of the board, a4 to block any activity for white, but allowing the square or b4 for the bishop to get into. Queen h3, some x-raying on the pawn on h7 in the future with the bishop and the queen. Knight goes to e4, exchange of the knights on g6, and knight f3. Aronian is trying to get another knight to a square f5. Caruana doesn't allow it by the move f6, but this creates some weaknesses on the pawns on e6 and g6, and immediately Aronian plays knight h4, hitting on one of those weaknesses on the pawn on g6. Queen have to be moved to f7 to protect that pawn on g6. Queen g4, putting another attacker on the pawn on g6. King h7 to protect that pawn. Rook f3 looks logical. Aronian wants to put the rook on h3 and put real pressure on the black king. f5 hitting the queen, queen h3, and now it looks like there is a threat of a discovery check. Knight takes f5. But interestingly enough, the best move for black here was rook h8. Rook h8, not to be afraid of any discovery checks. And indeed, if white played knight f5 check, they were actually losing after king g8. And now it turns out that the knight and the queen is under attack. So the only way to protect both pieces is to play knight h4. But then we have queen f6, hitting the knight on h4, which is pinned, by the way. Pretty much the only move, g3, and now we have g5. Again, attacking that knight. And after, let's say, f takes g5, we just have knight takes g5, attacking both the rook and the queen. And for example, if rook takes f6, rook takes the queen, then we take here with the check and just move back, and this position is totally winning for black. So therefore, rook h8 was a very interesting idea that Caruana didn't find, and instead he played king g8. That looks very logical to remove the king from this discovery attacks. Rook went to e3, and here Caruana should have played the move g5, and he did play that move, and now has an absolutely winning position. F takes g5, knight takes g5, attacking the queen. Queen moves away, and rook and bishop goes to e7, totally losing all advantage. The best continuation for black here was queen h5 and some variations, let's say knight f3, then f4. So that was the right continuation for black. Instead, they played bishop e7, retrieving the bishop, and now this position is even. Queen c7, attacking both the bishop and the pawn. Rook f6, protecting the bishop in this smart way, removing the bishop to f6. Queen takes b6, rook b8, and queen takes a5. Despite the fact that Aronian took 2 pawns, he allowed black to have a really great initiative on the board, and the engine considered this position better for black despite being 2 pawns down. Queen h5. The way to continue this game was bishop c6, putting pressure on the pawn on b3. Instead, queen h5. Queen e1 to protect the knight on h4, f4 attacking the rook, bishop e2 counterattacking the queen, queen moves back, rook c3, and rook e8. The best move for black was knight e4, attacking the rook, putting pressure on the knight on h4, but instead black played rook e8, and this position is already better for white. Knight f3, knight e4, the rook moves away to d3, bishop a6, putting attack on the pawn on c4 using the fact that the pawn is pinned. Rook c1, rook b8. Now the other rook is activated on the open file. You can see that black pieces are getting very active. Bishop a3 hitting the rook moves away to c8, not only moves away, but also occupies now an open file c. And here is a big mistake for Aronian. He puts his knight into e5, and it's a big mistake because after bishop takes e5, d takes e5, there is a check on a7 that probably Aronian didn't see. And now if king goes to h1, there would be simply knight f2, and white will lose a rook. Therefore, the only move is king f1, and here comes d takes c4, b takes c4, and bishop takes c4, and we can see that black pieces are absolutely greatly placed on the board, and all initiative is in Caruana's hands. Rook moves away to f3, and here black had to continue with the pressure and putting the bishop on d5. Instead, Caruana played more pragmatically. He took the bishop on e2, so exchange on the bishop on c2, exchange of the rooks on c1, and rook b1, pinning the bishop to the king. Black's position looks pretty much winning, but in reality, nothing is decided in this game, and computer still shows that this position is a draw. Until white took the knight on e4. And now it's absolutely winning for black after rook takes c1, king e2, and now Caruana had to find a nice geometrical motif playing the queen a5 because there was no way for white to defend the move queen e1, and there would be a checkmate in several moves there. So we can take a look. Let's say queen a5, and if white makes pretty much any moves, let's say rook takes f4, first of all they can lose then immediately they will lose the queen, and if let's say they move the queen somewhere to d4, for example, then after queen e1, king d3, rook d1, they still lose the queen. So in any case, move rook queen a5 was absolutely winning. Caruana didn't find it and played queen g1. Now this is a draw again, until the next move made by Aronian, queen takes f4. I have to tell you, the amount of mistakes that was made in this game between two top players in the world is simply astonishing. And obviously this is a blitz game, and we can see that Aronian has 9 seconds on the clock and Caruana 5 seconds, but still it's very unusual. They both played this game at 77% accuracy. Normally, grandmasters, even in blitz games, they are in the 90% accuracy range. So 77% is absolutely awful for those type of players. But again, the pressure of the tournament, I guess, took its toll. So again, queen takes f4, devastating mistake. And after queen e1 check, king d3, Caruana had to find a way to checkmate the opponent and win the game. So he puts the queen on c3 check, king e2. Now he goes back, which tells me that he didn't find immediately the way how to win this game. So he repeated the moves. And after king d3, he still didn't find a way to immediately win the game. But what he needed to find was the move queen c3, and then after king e2, the next continuation, queen b2 check. And let's say after king d3, then rook c3, king e4, and queen b4. And that's a checkmate. So that was the way to win this game immediately. But Caruana didn't find it, and he played. So this is again the variation that I wanted to show you. But in the game, Caruana played queen e1 check and queen d1 check. And this position is a draw. White just had to find the right moves. Queen d2, queen b3 check, king e2, queen c4 check, queen d3, still a draw, rook c2 check. Now this is even better for white if they played king d1 in this position and they just had 2 extra pawns and could win the game. And he did find this move and played king d1, rook c1 check, king d2, queen c8. Computer shows that this is +2 for white. And in classical game with normal standard time control, Aronian would win this game. But again, in blitz, anything can happen. He makes the first mistake, queen b3 check. This loses all the advantage, but at least it's not losing the game yet. Rook g1, rook c3, check, rook d3 blocking the check, another check from g2, king goes to c1, queen g5 check. Again, this is just a draw. King goes to b1, and a very nice move, queen f5, pinning the rook on d3. And it's a nice move because white have to be really careful here. And Aronian wasn't careful. He played queen c3 and lost in one move. Because after queen f1 check, the only way to protect yourself from a checkmate is to play queen c1 and then queen d3, winning the rook. So Aronian resigned after queen f1 check. Caruana is leading the blitz match 2-1, and one more game remaining, in which Caruana played white, Aronian played black. Caruana starts with e4. We have d6 Pirt's defense, d4, knight f6, bishop d3, e5, knight f3, developing the knight, exchange of the pawns on d4, g6 to develop the bishop on g7 to put on this nice diagonal, castle, bishop g7, h3, not allowing any pieces, sorry, on g4, short castle, c4, taking full control of the square, d5, knight develops to d7, knight to c3, knight goes to e5, hitting the bishop on d3, and if the bishop moves away, black will take the pawn on c4. White just played bishop e3, and in a standard classical game, black would definitely take this bishop on d3 and exchange it for the knight. But in this particular case, let's remember, Aronian must win this blitz game. So the more pieces are exchanged from the board, the better for Caruana, who just needs a draw. And Aronian played this whole game with this in mind that he has to win. So he was taking chances, and we'll see why. Rook e8, b3, a6, bishop c2, bishop develops to d7, queen develops to d2, and the rooks are connected. And here we have first shot of the game, b5. That's a sacrifice of the pawn. as I mentioned before, Aronian must win this game, so he has to create some imbalances in the position, and b5 was the first move to do that. f4 hitting the knight retreats to c6, and Caruana simply takes the pawn on b5 and takes it with the knight. He has two connected pass pawns, A and B, on the queen side of the board. He has an extra pawn, but believe it or not, the engine says that this position is even, despite all those advantages for white, because again, activity, initiative is on the black side after knight b4, and this bishop is an absolute monster as well. Knight goes back to d4, and that was a critical mistake, because after c5, knight f3, here black were basically winning if Aronian found this combination. He had to take the bishop on c2. And after queen takes c2, he had this shot, tactical shot, knight takes e4. And after knight takes e4, bishop takes a1. And let's say rook takes a1, bishop f5. And this knight is pinned and really cannot be protected. So let's say if you protect it with another knight, there is simply queen e7. And again, three attackers on the knight on e4. It cannot be protected. Black easily win. Aronian, unfortunately for him, didn't find this combination and played the move d5. He sacrificed another pawn on c5. Now he took the bishop on c2, queen takes c2, and knight takes e4 using the pin. White still took the knight on e4, and now if bishop takes a1, there is intermediate move knight d6, attacking the rook, and the bishop here is still under attack on a1. So black couldn't take the rook. They played bishop f5. Aronian is spinning the knight on e4. Rook d1, bishop takes e4, and queen f2. So let's take a look at what's in front of us. In front of us is the position where white has an extra pawn, but black have an advantage of two great bishops. Overall, these types of positions are considered even. Queen a5, a4, rook c8, b4, sacrificing the pawn on a4, but making sure that the bishop on c5 is overly protected. Queen takes a4, and knight g5. Caruana definitely didn't want to stand this bishop on e4 and immediately advised to capture it. And now if the bishop moves away, white will simply take the pawn on d5. And still, Aronian, again, knowing that he has to win this game, he really wanted to keep this bishop on the board, and he played bishop c2 and allowed the move rook takes d5, and white has an extra pawn. But again, black has two bishop pair and some chances to create commotion on the board, and that's exactly what he needs when he must win the game. So bishop took b3, bishop c4 attacking the rook on f1, rook c1 attacking the bishop, and rook goes to e2, creating some chances on the second rank. The queen is under attack, so queen f3 and bishop b5. 11 seconds remaining on the clock for Aronian, 9 seconds remaining for Caruana. Bishop b5 is a mistake. Why? Because all of a sudden, white had a great tactical shot, knight takes f7. And it turns out that if king takes f7, then they're getting checkmated after queen d5 check, king e8, rook e6 check, exchange of the rooks, queen e7 checkmate. So that was a very nice tactical combination. Not sure if Caruana missed it, or he just plays more pragmatic because the draw is in his favor. He just attacks that pawn with the queen and the knight. But after queen a2, Aronian protects the pawn f7 through the queen, x-raying that pawn. Caruana happily exchanges the queens on a2, plays rook d1, and after bishop c3, Caruana was winning with rook d8, which he played in the game, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, and king g7. And here the winning move was bishop f8 check. After king f6, knight e4, fork, winning the bishop. Again, pragmatic player Caruana, he needs a draw, and he wants to make a draw, so he exchanges more pieces, bishop d4, and exchanging the bishop on d4. Bishop c6, hitting the pawn on g2. Caruana obviously doesn't blunder it. Knight f3, blocking the diagonal for the bishop. Rook b2. Knight goes to d2. This position cannot be won. Cannot be won by Aronian. I'll go quickly the rest of the way because nothing really was happening. After a series of exchanges in this position, both players agreed to a draw, and the match, the blitz match, was won by Caruana 2.5 to 1.5.